The gunshot that shattered the morning silence wasn't meant for Beatrice Sutherland, but it changed her life forever nonetheless, sending her stumbling backward into the dusty street of Dalhart, Texas, where a tall cowboy named Pierce Vaughn caught her before she hit the ground. His hands were rough and calloused, his grip steady as he pulled her out of the line of fire, his body shielding hers as another shot rang out from the saloon across the street. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, her carefully pinned hair coming loose from its arrangement as Pierce dragged her behind a water trough, his gray eyes scanning the street with the practiced ease of a man who had seen his share of trouble. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice low and urgent, and Beatrice found herself obeying without question, pressing her back against the rough wood of the trough as the sounds of shouting and breaking glass filled the air. She had only been in Dalhart for 3 days, having traveled from Boston to take up a position as schoolteacher in this rough Texas panhandle town. And already, she was questioning every decision that had brought her to this God-forsaken place. The advertisement had made it sound so civilized, so full of opportunity for an educated woman seeking adventure and purpose. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of life on the edge of civilization in the spring of 1882. Pierce risked a glance over the trough, his jaw tight, before looking down at the woman he had just saved. She was dressed far too nicely for Dalhart, her traveling dress a deep blue that had probably cost more than most folks in town made in a month, and her face held that look of shocked bewilderment that newcomers always wore when they first encountered the harsh realities of frontier life. But there was something in her eyes, a spark of determination beneath the fear that made him look twice. "You hurt?" he asked, his drawl thick as molasses, and Beatrice shook her head, not trusting her voice just yet. Her hands were trembling, she realized, and she clasped them together in her lap to still them, refusing to let this stranger see how frightened she truly was. The shooting had stopped as suddenly as it had started, and now the sheriff was emerging from his office, his badge catching the morning sun as he strode toward the saloon with his hand on his pistol. Pierce waited a moment longer, making sure the danger had passed, before offering Beatrice his hand to help her up. She hesitated only briefly before taking it, and as their skin touched, something electric passed between them, something that made them both pause and lock eyes for just a heartbeat too long. "Thank you," Beatrice said, finally finding her voice as she stood and began brushing the dust from her skirts with shaking hands. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." Pierce tipped his hat, a gesture that seemed almost quaint given the circumstances. "Just wrong place, wrong time for you, madam. Happens more often than it should around here." He studied her more carefully now, taking in the quality of her dress, the education evident in her speech, the way she held herself with a straight back despite having just been shot at. "You new to town?" "I arrived on Wednesday's stage," Beatrice confirmed, tucking a loose strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear. "I'm the new schoolteacher, Beatrice Sutherland." Something shifted in Pierce's expression, a flicker of surprise followed by what might have been respect. "Pierce Vaughn," he introduced himself properly. "I run cattle north of town. We heard the school board finally found someone willing to come out here." He paused, then added with brutal honesty, "Last teacher didn't make it 6 weeks before heading back east." Beatrice lifted her chin, a stubborn set to her jaw that Pierce found oddly appealing. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Vaughn. I signed a contract for a full year, and I intend to honor it. Call me Pierce," he said, then nodded toward the boarding house at the end of the street. "You staying at Mrs. Fletcher's place?" "I am, yes. She's been very kind, though I must admit the accommodations are somewhat more rustic than I'm accustomed to." Beatrice managed a small smile, trying to inject some levity into the situation despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Pierce found himself returning the smile, something warm unfurling in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I imagine everything out here is more rustic than Boston." When she looked surprised, he explained, "Your accent. My mother was from Massachusetts. Recognized it right away." "Was?" Beatrice asked gently, catching the past tense. "Died when I was 12. Fever took her one winter." Pierce's expression darkened, but he shook off the memory. "Come on, let me walk you back to Mrs. Fletcher's. Make sure you get there in one piece." As they walked down the dusty main street of Dalhart, Beatrice found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. Pierce Vaughn was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor and skin bronzed from years under the Texas sun. He moved with an easy confidence, his long legs covering ground in unhurried strides, and there was something solid and dependable about him that Beatrice found reassuring in this uncertain new world she had entered. His face was handsome in a rugged way, all strong angles and weathered lines, with gray eyes that seemed to see everything and miss nothing. "How long have you been ranching here?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to fill the silence that had fallen between them. "Built my place about 5 years ago. Started with nothing but 100 head of cattle and more determination than sense." Pierce's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Now I've got near 3,000 head and a ranch that's starting to look like something real. Got 4 men working for me full-time, and we do right well during cattle drives." "That sounds like quite an accomplishment," Beatrice said sincerely. "Building something from nothing takes tremendous courage." Pierce glanced at her, surprised by the genuine admiration in her voice. Most of the fine ladies he had encountered in his life looked down on cowboys and ranchers, seeing them as little better than the cattle they herded. But Beatrice Sutherland seemed different, seemed to understand the value of hard work and determination, regardless of where it was applied. "Could say the same about you," he replied. "Coming all the way from Boston to teach school in a rough town like Dalhart, that takes courage too." They had reached the boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days, but was kept clean and respectable by its proprietor, the widow Mary Fletcher. Beatrice paused at the bottom of the steps, turning to face Pierce fully, and found herself reluctant to say goodbye to this man who had appeared in her life so suddenly and dramatically. "Will I see you again, Mr. Vaughn?" she asked, then caught herself. "Pierce, I mean." He considered for a moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "School starts Monday, doesn't it?" "Yes, at 8 o'clock. Then I'll be there. Got some business with the hardware store anyway, might as well stop by and see how the new teacher is settling in." Pierce touched the brim of his hat again. "You take care, Miss Sutherland, and maybe avoid walking past the saloon for a while." Beatrice watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller as he headed toward the hitching post where his horse waited, a magnificent chestnut gelding with a white blaze on its face. Something had shifted in her world in the span of those few terrifying minutes, something she couldn't quite name, but could feel settling into her bones like certainty. Pierce Vaughn was going to be important to her, she realized. How or why, she couldn't say, but she knew it as surely as she knew her own name. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Beatrice threw herself into organizing the small schoolhouse, sweeping out the dust that had accumulated during its vacancy, arranging the mismatched desks into neat rows, and inventorying the meager supplies the school board had provided. The building was simple, just one room with a wood stove for heat and windows that let in the bright Texas sunlight, but Beatrice was determined to make it a proper place of learning. She had brought books with her from Boston, precious volumes of literature and science that she unpacked carefully and arranged on the shelves at the back of the room. Mrs. Fletcher proved to be a font of information about the town and its inhabitants, sharing gossip over breakfast and dinner that Beatrice tried to keep track of, but often found overwhelming in its complexity. Who was feuding with whom? Which ranchers were prospering and which were struggling? Which families had children of school age and which could be counted on to actually send them to classes regularly? It was a lot to absorb, but Beatrice was nothing if not diligent, and she filled a small notebook with notes and observations. "That Pierce Vaughn who walked you home the other day," Mrs. Fletcher said over Sunday dinner, her eyes twinkling with matchmaking interest. "He's one of the good ones, that man. Honest, hardworking, treats his ranch hands fair and pays them on time. Lost his father to outlaws about 3 years back, but he kept the ranch going, built it up even bigger. Women in town have been setting their caps for him something fierce, but he never seems interested." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. He was simply being kind, helping a stranger in distress. "Hum," Mrs. Fletcher said knowingly. "Well, kind or not, fact remains that Pierce Vaughn doesn't usually go out of his way for people unless he's got a reason. Just saying, dear." Monday morning dawned clear and hot, the Texas sun already beating down mercilessly by the time Beatrice made her way to the schoolhouse. She wore her most practical dress, a gray cotton that wouldn't show the dust quite so badly, and had pinned her hair into a severe bun at the nape of her neck. She wanted to look professional, authoritative, someone the children would respect, and the parents would trust with their offspring's education. To her surprise and delight, 15 children showed up that first day, ranging in age from 6 to 14, their faces scrubbed clean and their clothes patched but neat. They filed in quietly, eyeing their new teacher with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, and took their seats as Beatrice stood at the front of the room with her hands clasped and her heart racing. "Good morning, students," she began, her voice clear and confident despite her nerves. "My name is Miss Sutherland, and I'm very pleased to be your teacher this year. I know I'm new to Dalhart, and I have much to learn about this place and all of you, but I promise to do my very best to give you an excellent education. In return, I ask that you work hard, treat each other with respect, and always be curious. The world is full of wonders, and learning opens doors you never knew existed." The children stared at her, some with interest, some with skepticism, but all were quiet and attentive. Beatrice launched into her first lesson, starting with introductions so she could learn all their names and something about each of them. There was Tommy Carter, 8 years old, whose father ran the general store; Sarah and Samuel Morrison, twins who lived on a small farm east of town; Elizabeth Hartley, 13, who had hungry eyes for learning and a sharp mind that Beatrice immediately recognized and appreciated. And so on, each child a small window into the life of this frontier community. She was so absorbed in her teaching that she didn't notice when Pierce Vaughn slipped into the back of the room sometime mid-morning, leaning against the wall with his hat in his hands and a small smile playing at his lips as he watched her work. It was only when she turned to write something on the chalkboard that she caught sight of him, and her hand faltered for just a moment before she recovered and continued with the lesson. When she finally dismissed the children for their lunch break, they tumbled out of the schoolhouse in a noisy rush, leaving Beatrice alone with Pierce. He pushed off from the wall and walked toward her desk, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You're a natural," he said without preamble. The kids were hanging on every word. Beatrice felt that warmth in her cheeks again. "You're very kind, but I think they were mostly just curious about the new teacher. The novelty will wear off soon enough. Maybe not." Pierce set his hat on the corner of her desk. "Brought you something." He pulled a package wrapped in brown paper from inside his vest and held it out to her. Curious, Beatrice unwrapped it carefully and found herself holding a beautiful leather-bound journal, the cover tooled with an intricate pattern of flowers and vines. "Pierce, this is too much," she protested, even as her fingers traced the delicate design with obvious appreciation. "Saw it in the general store and thought of you. Figured a teacher might have use for a nice journal, maybe to write down lessons or thoughts about your students." He shrugged, suddenly looking almost bashful. "If you don't want it, I can take it back." "No," Beatrice clutched the journal to her chest. "I love it, truly. Thank you so much. I'll treasure it." She looked up at him, her blue eyes soft with genuine gratitude. "You didn't have to do this." "Wanted to," Pierce said simply. "Also wanted to ask if you might be interested in having dinner with me sometime. There's not much in the way of fine dining in Dalhart, but the hotel restaurant makes a decent steak, and Mrs. Henderson serves a Sunday supper that's worth writing home about." Beatrice's heart skipped. "Are you asking to court me, Mr. Vaughn?" "I am, Miss Sutherland. If you're amenable to being courted by a rancher who spends most of his time smelling like cattle and dirt." Pierce held her gaze steadily, his gray eyes serious. "I think I might be very amenable to that," Beatrice replied softly, a smile spreading across her face that made Pierce's breath catch in his chest. "Though I should warn you, I know absolutely nothing about ranching or cattle or anything remotely useful in this environment. I can conjugate Latin verbs and recite Shakespeare, but I couldn't rope a steer to save my life." Pierce laughed, a deep, genuine sound that filled the schoolhouse. "Well, I can't conjugate Latin verbs, but I can teach you to ride a horse if you're willing to learn. Seems like a fair trade." "I'd like that very much." They agreed that Pierce would come by on Saturday afternoon to take her riding, and then he would treat her to dinner at the hotel afterward. Beatrice found herself counting down the days, even as she threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy. The children were responding well to her methods. Even the older boys who she had worried might resent taking instruction from a woman barely older than themselves. She made the lessons engaging, incorporating stories and practical examples that related to their frontier lives. And slowly she began to see the spark of genuine interest kindling in their eyes. On Wednesday, a ranch hand rode into town with a message that Pierce had been called away unexpectedly to deal with rustlers who had hit a neighboring ranch, and he wasn't sure when he would be back. Beatrice felt a stab of disappointment followed immediately by worry for his safety. The reality of frontier life came crashing back to her with that simple message, the reminder that danger was always lurking just beyond the edges of civilization, that the men who lived here faced violence and death as a regular part of their existence. She threw herself into her work with even more determination, trying not to think about Pierce riding into danger, trying not to imagine all the terrible things that could happen to him. But at night, lying in her narrow bed at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, she found herself praying for his safety, promising God that if he would just bring Pierce back unharmed, she would never complain about the dust or the heat or the primitive conditions ever again. Pierce returned on Friday evening, dusty and tired but unharmed, and came straight to the boarding house to let Beatrice know he was back. Mrs. Fletcher led him into the parlor where Beatrice was sitting with a book, and the moment she saw him, she was on her feet, her book forgotten as she crossed the room in a rush. "You're safe," she breathed, stopping just short of throwing herself into his arms, suddenly remembering propriety and the fact that Mrs. Fletcher was watching with keen interest from the doorway. "I'm safe," Pierce confirmed, his eyes searching her face and seeing the worry and relief written there plain as day. Something warm and possessive unfurled in his chest at the realization that she had been afraid for him, that she cared what happened to him. "I'm sorry I couldn't get word to you sooner. We caught up with the rustlers pretty quick and the sheriff has them in custody now." "Were you hurt, even a little?" Beatrice asked, her eyes scanning him for signs of injury. "Not a scratch, I promise." Pierce wanted desperately to reach out and touch her, to pull her close and feel her warmth against him, but he was too aware of their audience and the rules of proper courtship that governed interactions between unmarried men and women. "Are we still on for tomorrow?" "I understand if you'd rather wait until I've had a chance to clean up and rest." "No, tomorrow is perfect. I've been looking forward to it all week." Beatrice smiled at him, that radiant smile that made Pierce feel like he could take on the world and win. Saturday afternoon found Beatrice dressed in the most practical outfit she owned. A split skirt she had purchased from the general store specifically for riding, and boots that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her select. Pierce arrived right on time, leading a gentle mare behind his own horse, and Beatrice felt a flutter of nervousness as she approached the animals. "This is Daisy," Pierce introduced the mare, stroking her neck affectionately. "She's the sweetest tempered horse I've ever known, perfect for a beginner. She'll take good care of you." Over the next hour, Pierce taught Beatrice the basics of mounting, sitting properly in the saddle, holding the reins, and directing the horse with gentle pressure from her legs and shifts in her weight. He was patient and encouraging, never making her feel foolish for her inexperience, and gradually Beatrice began to relax and even enjoy herself. They rode slowly out of town, heading toward Pierce's ranch to the north, and Beatrice marveled at the vast expanse of land stretching out in every direction, the endless sky above and the golden grass rippling in the breeze like waves on an ocean. "It's beautiful," she said wonderingly. "I never imagined anything could be so big, so open." "Wait until you see it at sunset," Pierce replied, bringing his horse alongside hers. "Sky turns every color you can imagine, like God decided to show off a little." They rode for another hour, Pierce pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the land and the people who lived there. He showed her where his property began, marked by fence posts that his men had spent backbreaking weeks setting in the hard ground, and where his cattle grazed in distant clusters, dark shapes against the pale grass. There was pride in his voice when he talked about his ranch, but also a kind of humility, an awareness that he was just a steward of this land, that it would be here long after he was gone. When they returned to town, the sun was indeed setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that took Beatrice's breath away. Pierce helped her dismount, his hand steady at her waist, and for a moment they stood very close, his hand still holding her, their eyes locked. Beatrice felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, to the warmth of his touch and the intensity of his gaze, and her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "We should get you cleaned up for dinner," Pierce said finally, his voice rougher than usual, and Beatrice nodded, not quite trusting herself to speak. Dinner at the hotel was a revelation. The dining room was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and oil lamps that cast a warm glow over everything. The steak Pierce had promised was indeed excellent, tender and flavorful, served with potatoes and green beans and fresh bread that Beatrice slathered with butter. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes and dreams, the paths that had led them both to this unlikely meeting place on the edge of the frontier. Beatrice learned that Pierce had grown up on his father's ranch, learning the cattle business from the time he could walk, that he had always dreamed of having his own place where he could do things his way, where he could build something lasting that would matter. His father's death had been devastating, but had also pushed him to make that dream a reality, to prove that he could not only survive but thrive in this harsh land. Pierce learned that Beatrice had grown up in a wealthy Boston family, the youngest of 4 daughters, that she had been expected to make a good marriage to some suitable man in their social circle, and settle into a life of tea parties and charity work. But she had wanted more, had wanted to do something meaningful with her life, to use her education for more than just impressing other society ladies. Teaching had seemed like the perfect solution, and when she had seen the advertisement for a teacher in Texas, she had applied on impulse, seeing it as an adventure and an escape from the suffocating expectations of her old life. "You miss it?" Pierce asked. "The life you left behind?" Beatrice considered the question carefully. "I miss my sisters sometimes and my mother, though we were never especially close. But I don't miss the life itself. I always felt like I was playing a part, wearing a costume and saying the lines I was expected to say. Here, I can be myself. It's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure." "And what is yourself?" Pierce asked softly, leaning forward across the table. "Someone who wants to matter," Beatrice said honestly. "Someone who wants to make a difference, even if it's just in the lives of 15 children in a small Texas town. Someone who wants to be valued for her mind and her capabilities, not just her family name or her marriageability." She paused, then added with a small smile, "Someone who is discovering she quite likes cowboys, as it turns out." Pierce felt his heart turn over in his chest. "This cowboy quite likes schoolteachers from Boston," he replied, his voice warm with affection and something deeper, something that was beginning to feel a lot like love. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt almost like a dream to Beatrice. She taught her students during the week, watching with pride as they began to make real progress in their reading and arithmetic, as they started to ask questions and engage with the material in ways that showed genuine curiosity. Elizabeth Hartley in particular was flourishing, devouring every book Beatrice could give her and showing a sharp analytical mind that Beatrice was determined to nurture and encourage. On weekends, Pierce came calling, taking Beatrice on rides across the prairie, teaching her about the land and the livestock, introducing her to his ranch hands who greeted her with shy politeness and obvious approval of their boss's choice in women. She met Miguel, Pierce's foreman, who had been with him from the beginning and was fiercely loyal. She met young Danny, barely 18, who had started as a drover and was learning the ranching business with wide-eyed enthusiasm. She met old Jake, a weathered cowboy who had seen more of life than most and had stories that could make her laugh or cry depending on his mood. Pierce brought her gifts, small tokens that showed he was thinking of her even when they were apart. A pretty stone he had found by the creek. A book of poetry he had ordered special from San Antonio. A wool shawl for the coming winter, practical but beautiful, dyed a deep blue that matched her eyes. Beatrice treasured each gift, but even more, she treasured the time they spent together, the conversations that ranged from silly to serious, the comfortable silences that fell between them as they rode side by side across the prairie. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing opinions on politics and religion and philosophy, discovering that they agreed on some things and disagreed on others, but always with respect for each other's viewpoints. Pierce was smarter than he gave himself credit for, Beatrice realized, his lack of formal education notwithstanding. He had a sharp mind and a natural curiosity about the world that matched her own, and she loved the way he listened to her, really listened, treating her ideas as valuable and worthy of consideration. The town was beginning to talk, of course. In a small community like Dalhart, Any developing romance was prime gossip material, and the courtship between the refined schoolteacher from Boston and the successful young rancher was particularly juicy. But the talk was mostly positive, approving, and Beatrice found that she didn't mind the attention as much as she might have expected. Let them talk, she thought. Let them see that Pierce Vaughn had chosen her, and she had chosen him, and they were building something real and true between them. By October, when the first cool breezes began to temper the brutal Texas heat, Beatrice realized that she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Pierce Vaughn. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather a gradual understanding that had been building for months. The recognition that she couldn't imagine her life without him in it. That the thought of returning to Boston, or going anywhere that he wasn't, made her chest tighten with something very much like panic. She was grading papers one Friday evening when Mrs. Fletcher came into her room with an expression of barely suppressed excitement. "Pierce Vaughn is downstairs asking to see you. Says it's important." Beatrice's heart leaped. Pierce wasn't supposed to come by until Saturday afternoon. For him to show up unannounced on a Friday evening meant something significant. She checked her reflection in the small mirror, tucking back a few wayward strands of hair, then hurried downstairs to find Pierce standing in the parlor looking nervous and determined in equal measure. "Pierce, is everything all right?" she asked, concern flooding through her. "Everything's fine," he assured her quickly, then ran a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of nerves. "I just needed to talk to you, and I couldn't wait until tomorrow, Mrs. Fletcher made herself scarce, though Beatrice strongly suspected she was hovering just outside the door, and Pierce took Beatrice's hands in his, holding them firmly as he looked into her eyes. "I'm not good with fancy words," he began, "and I know we've only been courting for a few months, which might seem too fast by Boston standards, but out here, life moves different. Out here, when you know something is right, you don't waste time dancing around it." He took a deep breath. "Beatrice Sutherland, I love you. I love your courage and your kindness and your sharp mind. I love the way you care about those kids and the way you're not afraid of hard work. I love how you've adapted to this life out here without complaining, how you've embraced it even. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." Beatrice felt tears pricking at her eyes, her throat tight with emotion. Pierce continued, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I know I can't offer you the kind of life you had in Boston. I can't give you fancy balls and society parties and all those things you grew up with. But I can give you a home filled with love, a partnership built on respect, and a life that matters. I can promise to honor you and cherish you every single day for as long as I draw breath. So I'm asking, Beatrice, will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" "Yes," Beatrice said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper before she repeated it louder, more certainly. "Yes, Pierce, I'll marry you. I love you too so very much, and I don't want the life I left behind in Boston. I want this life here with you. I want all of it." Pierce pulled her into his arms, holding her close as he buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, feeling the reality of her acceptance wash over him like a blessing. Beatrice clung to him, her arms wrapped around his neck, tears of joy sliding down her cheeks as she pressed herself against him, wanting to be as close as possible to this man who had become her entire world. When they finally pulled apart, Pierce reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a modest but beautiful sapphire that caught the lamplight and sparkled like captured starlight. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he slipped it onto her finger. "It's perfect," Beatrice insisted, holding up her hand to admire it. "Absolutely perfect, Mrs. Fletcher burst into the room at that moment, abandoning all pretense of not having been listening, and swept Beatrice into an enthusiastic hug while congratulating them both. "A Christmas wedding," she declared. "It simply must be a Christmas wedding. We'll get the whole town involved, make it something special." Pierce and Beatrice exchanged amused glances but didn't object. A Christmas wedding did sound lovely, and it gave them just enough time to make all the necessary preparations. Beatrice would finish out the fall term with her students, and they would marry during the winter break, giving her time to settle into her new life as a rancher's wife before the spring term began. The news spread through Dalhart like wildfire, and Beatrice was overwhelmed by the warmth and enthusiasm of the townspeople's response. Women she barely knew stopped her on the street to offer congratulations and advice. The students gave her handmade cards expressing their happiness for her, with little Elizabeth Hartley shyly asking if Miss Sutherland would still be their teacher after she got married. "Of course I will," Beatrice assured her. "Just because I'm becoming Mrs. Vaughn doesn't mean I'm giving up teaching. I made a commitment to you all, and I intend to keep it." Pierce had already thought of that, it turned out. He proposed converting one of the unused buildings on his ranch into living quarters for them, close enough to town that Beatrice could ride in each day for school, but still part of the ranch, where he needed to be for his work. "It won't be fancy at first," he warned her, "but I'll add on to it over time, make it into a real home for us." "As long as I'm with you, it will be home," Beatrice told him firmly. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. Beatrice worked with the local seamstress to create a wedding dress, a beautiful ivory gown with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simpler than what she might have worn in Boston but perfectly suited to her new life. Pierce and his ranch hands worked furiously to finish the renovations on the house, adding a parlor and an extra bedroom, installing a wood stove for cooking and windows with real glass that let in light while keeping out the wind. Beatrice wrote to her family in Boston, informing them of her engagement and upcoming marriage. She received a stiffly worded letter from her father expressing disappointment that she was marrying beneath her station, but offering grudging congratulations nonetheless. Her mother sent a more affectionate note along with a string of pearls that had been in the family for generations, a wedding gift, and a peace offering. Her sisters sent enthusiastic letters full of questions about her cowboy rancher and demands for details about frontier life, and Beatrice found herself laughing as she read their words, able to picture their faces and hear their voices even across the vast distance that separated them. December arrived, bringing with it cooler temperatures and preparations for Christmas. The schoolhouse was decorated with pine boughs and paper chains that the students made during art lessons, and Beatrice organized a Christmas pageant that had the whole town talking. Pierce spent more time in town than usual, consulting with the carpenter about furniture for the house, selecting supplies from the general store, and generally behaving like a man on the verge of starting a new chapter in his life. The wedding was set for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, at the small church that served Dalhart's faithful. Reverend Thompson, a kind man with a booming voice and a gentle heart, agreed to perform the ceremony, and Mrs. Fletcher took charge of organizing the celebration that would follow, conscripting half the women in town to help with cooking and decorating. The night before the wedding, Pierce wasn't supposed to see Beatrice according to tradition, so he spent the evening at the ranch with his men, who ribbed him good-naturedly about his last night of freedom while also expressing genuine happiness for him. Miguel pulled him aside at one point, his weathered face serious. "Your father would be proud of you, Pierce," the older man said quietly. "You've built something good here, and now you're bringing a good woman into it. You're doing right by all of us, by this place, by the legacy your father left you." Pierce felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Miguel. That means more than you know." "Take care of her," Miguel continued. "That lady of yours, she's special. She's got a good heart and she's stronger than she looks. But this life is hard and she's going to need you to help her through the rough patches." "I will," Pierce promised. "With everything I have, I will." Beatrice spent her last night as an unmarried woman at the boarding house, surrounded by Mrs. Fletcher and several other women from town who had come to help her prepare, and to offer their own brand of wisdom about marriage and men and life on the frontier. Some of their advice made her blush, and some of it made her laugh, but all of it touched her deeply, this acceptance into the community of women who had claimed her as one of their own. Elizabeth Hartley arrived with her mother, carrying a carefully wrapped package that she presented to Beatrice with shy pride. Inside was a beautifully embroidered handkerchief, the work of many hours, with Beatrice's new initials in one corner. "I wanted to make you something special," Elizabeth said softly, "to thank you for being such a good teacher and to wish you happiness." Beatrice hugged the girl tightly, tears threatening again. "Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll treasure this always, and I'll think of you every time I use it." The morning of December 23rd dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch on forever. Beatrice woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement, and allowed Mrs. Fletcher and her helpers to fuss over her as they dressed her hair and helped her into her wedding gown. The pearls from her mother went around her neck, and she held Elizabeth's handkerchief as her something old and something new combined with the borrowed hairpins from Mrs. Fletcher and the blue garter that the seamstress had insisted every bride needed. The church was packed when she arrived, seemingly everyone in Dalhart and the surrounding area having turned out for the wedding. Pierce was already at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaven. When he saw Beatrice walking down the aisle toward him, his expression transformed into something so full of love and awe that several women in the congregation had to dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Beatrice had no father to give her away, so she walked down the aisle alone, her head held high and her eyes fixed on Pierce, on the future they were about to begin together. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and she saw that his were trembling slightly, just as hers were, and somehow that made her feel better, less alone in her nervousness. Reverend Thompson began the ceremony, his voice filling the church with words about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Pierce and Beatrice spoke their vows clearly, both of them meaning every word with their whole hearts. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and told Pierce he could kiss his bride, Pierce cupped Beatrice's face gently in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that it felt like a promise, like a preview of all the love and care he would shower upon her for the rest of their days. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Beatrice had experienced in Boston's formal society. There was music and dancing, with fiddles and guitars providing energetic tunes that had everyone clapping and laughing. There was food in abundance, tables laden with dishes that women had spent days preparing, all of it delicious and made with love. There were toasts and speeches, some funny and some touching, all of them expressing genuine affection for the couple and hopes for their happiness. Pierce danced with Beatrice, holding her close as they swayed to a slower song, oblivious to everyone around them. "Happy," he murmured against her ear. "Deliriously," Beatrice replied, leaning into him. "I can't believe this is my life now, that I get to have you forever." "Forever," Pierce agreed, pulling back enough to look into her eyes. "That's exactly what you get. My heart, my home, my name, my life. all of it forever. As the afternoon wore into evening, Pierce leaned down to whisper to his new wife, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Vaughn." The name sent a thrill through Beatrice. Mrs. Vaughn. She was Mrs. Pierce Vaughn now, starting a whole new chapter of her life. "Yes, I'm ready." They said their goodbyes, accepting final hugs and well wishes from the guests, then climbed into the wagon Pierce had prepared, loaded with gifts and supplies, and everything they would need to begin their life together. The ranch was only an hour's ride from town, and the sun was just beginning to set as they approached it, painting the sky in those brilliant colors Pierce had promised her that first day they rode together. The house looked welcoming in the fading light, smoke curling from the chimney where Miguel had started a fire to warm the place before tactfully making himself scarce. Pierce pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, then came around to Beatrice's side. But instead of helping her down in the usual way, he reached up and scooped her into his arms, wedding dress and all, carrying her toward the house. Beatrice laughed in surprise, her arms going around his neck. "Pierce, what are you doing?" "Following tradition," he said with a grin. "Got to carry my bride across the threshold, don't I?" He shouldered open the door and stepped inside, and Beatrice caught her breath at what she saw. The main room was warm and cozy, the fire crackling in the hearth, oil lamps casting a golden glow over furniture that was simple but well made. There were curtains at the windows, a rug on the floor, and small touches everywhere that showed Pierce had put thought and care into making this a real home, not just a place to sleep. She saw books on a shelf that he must have purchased for her, a rocking chair positioned by the fireplace, and through an open doorway, a glimpse of a bedroom with a large bed covered in a beautiful quilt. Pierce carried her across the threshold and then kept walking, taking her into the center of the room before finally setting her on her feet. He kept his arms around her, though, holding her close as he looked around at what he had created, what would now be theirs together. "This is yours forever," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This house, this land, this life we're going to build here. It's all yours, Beatrice. You're home now, and you're never going to have to leave unless you want to. This is where you belong, where we belong together." Beatrice felt tears spilling down her cheeks again, but they were happy tears, tears of overwhelming joy and gratitude and love. She looked up at her husband, this strong, tender man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed everything, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I love you so much, Pierce Vaughn, and I promise I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of this gift you've given me." "You don't have to try," Pierce said, wiping her tears away with his thumbs. "You already are worthy. You're everything I ever hoped for and more than I ever thought I deserved. You're my heart, Beatrice, my home, my forever." He kissed her then, a deep, passionate kiss that spoke of love and desire and commitment, and Beatrice kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her feelings into that connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers, his arms still holding her tight. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," he murmured. "Home," Beatrice repeated, testing the word and finding it perfect. "Yes, I'm home." The fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, but inside that small house on the Texas prairie, two souls had found their perfect match, their forever love, and the beginning of a story that would last a lifetime. The first months of marriage were an adjustment period filled with both challenges and joys. Beatrice returned to teaching after the Christmas break, rising early each morning to ride into town with Pierce, who would drop her at the schoolhouse, before heading to whatever work needed doing on the ranch. She threw herself into her students' education with renewed energy, finding that her happiness in her personal life seemed to make her an even better teacher, more patient and creative and engaged. The children noticed the change in their teacher, saw the glow of contentment that surrounded her, and they responded with their own increased effort. Even the boys who had been resistant at first were now applying themselves, and Beatrice felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching them grow and learn. Elizabeth Hartley continued to excel, and Beatrice began to harbor dreams of helping the girl continue her education beyond what the Dalhart school could provide, perhaps even preparing her for college back east if Elizabeth's parents could be convinced. At home, Beatrice learned the rhythms of ranch life, adapting to the demands and routines that governed their days. She learned to cook on the wood stove, at first burning more meals than she successfully prepared but gradually improving, until she could produce decent meals that Pierce always ate with enthusiastic appreciation, even when they were less than perfect. She learned to manage the household budget, stretching their money to cover necessities while still saving for future improvements to the house and ranch. Pierce, for his part, proved to be everything Beatrice could have hoped for in a husband. He was patient with her learning curve, never mocking her mistakes or making her feel foolish for her ignorance of frontier life. He was affectionate and attentive, always making sure she knew how much he loved and valued her. And he was endlessly supportive of her teaching, never once suggesting that she should give it up now that she was a married woman, understanding that her work mattered to her and respecting that. They fell into comfortable patterns, quiet evenings by the fire where Beatrice would grade papers while Pierce mended tack or went over the ranch accounts, stolen moments of intimacy and connection that deepened their bond. They talked about their days, sharing stories and concerns, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating successes together. It was the kind of partnership Beatrice had always dreamed of, but never thought she would find, especially not in a small Texas town so far from everything she had known. Spring brought new challenges as calving season arrived. Pierce was often gone from before dawn until after dark, helping his ranch hands with the difficult and dangerous work of assisting cattle through births, protecting the newborn calves from predators, and managing the increased workload. Beatrice worried about him constantly, knowing the risks involved, but she also saw the satisfaction he took in successfully growing his herd, in the tangible results of his hard work. When Pierce came home exhausted and covered in dirt and worse, Beatrice would heat water for him to wash, prepare a hot meal no matter the hour, and listen as he told her about his day. Sometimes he would fall asleep in his chair before he could even finish eating, and she would gently wake him enough to get him to bed, her heart swelling with love for this man who worked so hard to provide for them and build their future. One particularly difficult night in April, a cow was having a breech birth and Pierce had to work for hours in the dark and the mud to save both the mother and calf. He came home well after midnight, looking more exhausted than Beatrice had ever seen him, and she helped him wash up and got him into bed, holding him close as he finally let the tension of the day drain away. "I was so worried," she whispered against his shoulder. "When you didn't come home at the usual time, I imagined all sorts of terrible things." "I'm sorry," Pierce murmured, his arms tightening around her. "Should have sent Danny with a message, didn't think how you'd worry." "Just promise me you'll always come back to me," Beatrice said, her voice breaking slightly. "Promise me you'll be careful and come home safe." "I promise," Pierce said firmly, pulling back to look at her in the moonlight streaming through their window. "Nothing could keep me from coming back to you, Beatrice. Nothing." They made love that night with a tenderness and intensity that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes, a physical affirmation of the promises they had just spoken, a claiming and a surrender that left them both breathless and clinging to each other like lifelines. Summer arrived with its brutal heat, temperatures that made teaching in the small schoolhouse almost unbearable despite Beatrice keeping all the windows open, and the students fanning themselves constantly. Pierce worried about her riding back and forth in the heat, and suggested she might want to stay in town during the week, but Beatrice refused, insisting that she wanted to come home to him every night, that the heat was manageable with proper precautions. They developed a routine of cooling baths in the evening, Pierce pumping water from the well while Beatrice prepared cold suppers that didn't require heating up the house with the stove. They would sit outside on the porch he had built, watching the sun set and feeling the slight cooling that came with twilight, talking about their days and their dreams for the future. It was during one of those quiet evening conversations that Beatrice first broached the subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "Pierce, I think I might be pregnant." Pierce went very still, his glass of water halfway to his lips. "Are you sure?" "Not completely certain, but I've missed 2 monthly cycles now, and I've been feeling tired and a bit queasy in the mornings." Beatrice watched his face anxiously, trying to gauge his reaction. "I know we haven't talked much about children, about when we wanted to start a family. If it's too soon, I'm sorry, I didn't plan for this to happen quite so quickly." Pierce set down his glass and pulled Beatrice into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Too soon? Beatrice, this is wonderful news, amazing news, I couldn't be happier." He pulled back to look at her face, his eyes shining with joy and wonder. "We're going to have a baby. You're going to be a mother and I'm going to be a father. How could that ever be too soon?" Relief flooded through Beatrice, followed by her own surge of joy. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I don't know anything about being a mother, about raising a child out here. What if I'm terrible at it?" "You won't be terrible at it," Pierce said firmly. "Look at how good you are with your students, how much they love you and respect you. You're going to be a wonderful mother, Beatrice. And I'll be right there with you, figuring it all out together." They went to see Doc Morrison in town the next day, and he confirmed what Beatrice had suspected. She was indeed pregnant, about 3 months along by his estimation, which meant the baby would arrive sometime around early December. The doctor examined her thoroughly and pronounced her healthy, giving her instructions about rest and nutrition and warning signs to watch for. The news spread through Dalhart with the usual speed, and Beatrice found herself the recipient of an outpouring of advice and support from the women of the town. Mrs. Fletcher was particularly excited, already planning baby showers and offering to help however she could. Elizabeth Hartley brought Beatrice a small blanket she had been knitting, her young face glowing with excitement at the prospect of her beloved teacher having a baby. Pierce was beside himself with joy and protectiveness, suddenly worried about every aspect of Beatrice's life and whether it might harm the baby. He wanted her to stop teaching immediately, to rest and take it easy, but Beatrice firmly refused. "I'm pregnant, not ill," she told him gently but firmly. "I can continue teaching until the fall term ends at least. The school board will need time to find a temporary replacement for me anyway." They compromised with Pierce accompanying her to and from town every day, making sure she didn't overexert herself, and having one of the ranch hands bring her lunch each day so she didn't have to worry about preparing it herself. Beatrice accepted these concessions with good grace, understanding that they came from love and concern, not from any desire to control or limit her. As her pregnancy progressed, Beatrice found herself falling more in love with Pierce every day, watching as he transformed before her eyes into a man preparing for fatherhood. He was constantly building things: a cradle for the baby to sleep in, a rocking chair more comfortable than the one they already had for Beatrice to nurse in, a toy box to hold the inevitable accumulation of playthings. He talked to her belly when they were alone, telling their unborn child about the ranch and the life they would have, making promises about the kind of father he would be. The school board reluctantly accepted that Beatrice would need to take a leave of absence after the fall term ended, and they hired a temporary teacher to take over until Beatrice felt ready to return. Beatrice felt a pang of sadness at leaving her students, but she knew it was the right decision. The baby was due in early December, and trying to teach up until the birth, and then immediately after would be foolish and potentially dangerous. Her last day of teaching before her leave was bittersweet. The students had prepared a special program, performing poems and recitations they had learned, and presenting Beatrice with handmade gifts for the baby. Elizabeth Hartley gave a particularly moving speech about what Miss Sutherland, now Mrs. Vaughn, had meant to her and to all of them, how she had opened up worlds beyond Dalhart through her teaching and her genuine care for each of them. Beatrice cried, of course, her emotions running high due to both her condition and the genuine affection she felt for these children who had been her first real students. "I'll be back," she promised them. "This isn't goodbye forever, just for a little while. And when I return, I expect to see that you've all continued working hard and learning everything Mr. Patterson teaches you." Pierce was waiting outside the schoolhouse with the wagon, and he helped his very pregnant wife up onto the seat before driving them home. Beatrice was quiet on the ride, processing her feelings about this new chapter beginning even as another temporarily closed. "You all right?" Pierce asked, glancing over at her with concern. "Yes," Beatrice said, placing a hand on her rounded belly where their child was growing. "I'm more than all right. I'm happy. It's just a lot of change all at once, you know. A year ago I was in Boston, preparing for another dreary winter of tea parties and empty socializing, feeling like my life was slipping away into meaninglessness. Now look at me. I'm married to the most wonderful man in the world. I'm about to become a mother. I have work that I love and a home that feels more real than anywhere I ever lived before. It's almost overwhelming how much my life has changed." Pierce reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "My life changed too, you know. Before you, I was just going through the motions, building the ranch but never really thinking about why or what it was all for. Then you showed up with your fancy dresses and your Boston accent, and suddenly everything made sense. I was building it for you, for us, for the family we would have together. You gave my life meaning, Beatrice. You gave me a reason for all the hard work beyond just survival." Beatrice squeezed his hand, her heart so full of love she thought it might burst. "We saved each other," she said softly. "I think that's what we did. We found each other when we both needed saving, and we built something beautiful together." "Yeah," Pierce agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, that's exactly what we did." November brought cooler weather and the final preparations for the baby's arrival. Pierce had converted the smaller bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow, and installing the furniture he had built over the past months. Beatrice washed and folded tiny clothes that women from town had given her, marveling at how small they were, trying to imagine a person tiny enough to wear them. She read books about childbirth and infant care that Doc Morrison had loaned her, trying to prepare herself mentally for what was coming, even as she acknowledged that no amount of reading could truly prepare someone for the reality of becoming a mother. Pierce was a bundle of nerves, constantly checking on Beatrice, asking if she was feeling all right, if she needed anything, if there was any sign that the baby might be coming. Miguel and the other ranch hands found his behavior highly amusing and teased him mercilessly. But they were also clearly excited about the upcoming arrival, already arguing about who would be the baby's favorite uncle. On December 2nd, a cold, clear morning with frost on the ground, Beatrice's labor began. She woke Pierce with a hand on his shoulder and a calm announcement that he needed to go get Doc Morrison because the baby was coming. Pierce shot out of bed like he had been fired from a cannon, pulling on clothes with shaking hands and nearly tripping over his own boots in his haste. "Slow down," Beatrice said, trying not to laugh despite the tightening sensation in her abdomen. "We have time. First babies usually take a while. Just go get the doctor and try not to fall off your horse in your excitement." Pierce kissed her hard, told her he loved her, and then was out the door and on his horse before Beatrice could say anything else. She heard the thunder of hoofbeats as he raced toward town, and she shook her head with affectionate exasperation. Men were useless during childbirth. Every woman had told her that, but she was grateful for Pierce's love and concern even if it did manifest as near panic. Mrs. Fletcher arrived with Doc Morrison, having insisted on coming along to help since Pierce had apparently banged on her door first in his frantic state. She bustled into the house with an air of calm competence that Beatrice found reassuring, immediately taking charge of heating water and gathering supplies while Doc Morrison examined Beatrice and pronounced that everything was progressing normally. "Could be hours yet," the doctor warned Pierce, who was hovering anxiously in the doorway. "Maybe you should go tend to your ranch work, keep yourself occupied. We'll call you when it's time." "I'm not leaving," Pierce said flatly. "I'm staying right here where Beatrice can see me if she needs me." As it turned out, the labor did indeed last for hours, long and difficult hours during which Beatrice discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Pierce stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand when she wanted it held, giving her space when she needed it, wiping her face with cool cloths and murmuring encouragement even when she snapped at him that he had no idea what he was talking about, and this was all his fault anyway. Mrs. Fletcher and Doc Morrison worked efficiently, guiding Beatrice through the process with experience and compassion. And finally, as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in those brilliant colors that Beatrice had come to love, her son was born. He emerged into the world with a lusty cry that announced his presence to everyone within hearing distance, and Doc Morrison placed him on Beatrice's chest, all slippery and perfect and absolutely beautiful. "A boy," Beatrice breathed, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her son for the first time. "Pierce, we have a son." Pierce was crying too, unashamed tears rolling down his cheeks as he stared at the miracle they had created. "He's perfect," he whispered, reaching out with a shaking hand to touch the baby's tiny fist. "Beatrice, he's absolutely perfect." "What are you going to name him?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, smiling at the new family with obvious satisfaction. Beatrice and Pierce looked at each other, having discussed this many times over the past months. "Robert," Beatrice said softly. "Robert Michael Vaughn after Pierce's father and mine." "Robert," Pierce repeated, testing it out. "Bobby, our son Bobby." The baby quieted as if recognizing his parents' voices, his tiny eyes trying to focus on their faces, and Beatrice felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible. This was her son, hers and Pierce's, a new life they had brought into the world together, a physical manifestation of their love. She had never felt anything so powerful, so overwhelming, so absolutely right. Doc Morrison finished his work, declaring both mother and baby healthy, and Mrs. Fletcher helped Beatrice into a clean nightgown and fresh sheets, before shooing everyone out so the new mother could rest. Pierce refused to go far, though, pulling a chair up next to the bed and sitting there with Bobby cradled carefully in his arms, staring at his son with an expression of such wonder and love that it made Beatrice's chest ache. "You were so brave," Pierce said quietly, glancing at his wife. "I knew you were strong, but watching you go through that, seeing what you endured to bring him into the world, it made me love you even more than I already did, which I didn't think was possible." "Worth it," Beatrice said, exhaustion making her words slur slightly. Every second of pain was worth it to have him, to have this. Pierce leaned over carefully and kissed her forehead. "Sleep, love. I'll watch over you both. You're safe and you're loved, and I'm never going to let anything happen to either of you." Beatrice drifted off to sleep with that promise echoing in her ears, feeling safer and more content than she had ever felt in her life. The first weeks with a newborn were both wonderful and exhausting. Bobby was a good baby overall, but he still required constant attention, needing to be fed and changed and comforted at all hours of the day and night. Beatrice threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning through trial and error how to meet her son's needs, gradually becoming more confident in her abilities. Pierce was a hands-on father from the start, not content to leave all the baby care to Beatrice as many men would have done. He learned to change diapers and swaddle Bobby securely, and he would walk the floor with his son for hours during fussy periods, singing old cowboy songs in his deep voice until Bobby finally settled. Beatrice would watch them together, her husband and her son, and feel such overwhelming love that she sometimes had to press a hand to her chest to contain it. Christmas that first year was a quiet, intimate affair, just the three of them in their home, with Bobby sleeping peacefully in his cradle while Beatrice and Pierce exchanged small gifts and talked about how much their lives had changed in just 1 year. Last Christmas, they had been newlyweds, nervous and excited about their future together. This Christmas, they were parents responsible for another life, their family complete in a way neither had fully anticipated. "Next year, Bobby will be old enough to maybe understand a little bit about Christmas," Pierce said, watching his son sleep. "We can start traditions, make memories as a family." "I'd like that," Beatrice agreed, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "I want to give him everything, Pierce. A happy childhood, a good education, the knowledge that he's loved unconditionally. I want him to grow up feeling secure and valued, able to be whoever he wants to be." "He will," Pierce promised. "With you as his mother, how could he not?" The months rolled into years, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Bobby grew from an infant into a toddler, then into a little boy full of curiosity and energy, constantly getting into things and asking endless questions that Beatrice answered with patience and enthusiasm. She returned to teaching when Bobby was 6 months old, bringing him with her to school where he would nap in a corner or play quietly while she taught. And the students adored having a baby in the classroom, taking turns helping to entertain him and showing remarkable gentleness and care. As Bobby grew older, Pierce would take him out to the ranch, teaching him about cattle and horses and the land, instilling in him a love of the frontier life that Pierce himself had always known. But Beatrice also made sure their son had books and education, reading to him every night and encouraging his natural intelligence. She was determined that Bobby would have choices in life, that he could choose to be a rancher like his father or something entirely different if that was what he wanted. The ranch prospered under Pierce's management, growing larger and more successful with each passing year. He was able to add more land, increase the size of his herd, and improve their home with additions and amenities that made life more comfortable. But Pierce never lost sight of what was truly important, never let his ambitions for the ranch overshadow his devotion to his family. He was present for Bobby's first steps, his first words, all the small milestones that marked his son's growth, and he made sure Beatrice knew every day how much he loved and appreciated her. When Bobby was 3 years old, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with excitement rather than nervousness, both of them feeling more prepared for parenthood the second time around. A daughter arrived in September of 1886, a beautiful baby girl with her mother's blue eyes and her father's dark hair, whom they named Sarah Grace. Bobby was enchanted with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Pierce was utterly smitten, discovering that having a daughter brought out protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Beatrice watched her family expand with joy and gratitude, marveling at the life she had built so far from the world she had known in Boston. She wrote regular letters to her family back east, sharing stories and occasionally photographs that a traveling photographer captured. Her sisters especially loved hearing about frontier life, living vicariously through Beatrice's adventures, and they sent gifts for the children and letters full of love and support. Her father eventually softened toward Pierce, particularly after Bobby was born, and her mother sent a steady stream of packages containing clothes and toys, and little luxuries that Beatrice appreciated even as she had learned to live without them. The years continued to pass, each one adding layers to their story. Bobby started school with his mother as his teacher, and he proved to be a bright student with a particular aptitude for mathematics and science. Sarah grew into a spirited little girl who kept everyone on their toes with her energy and mischief. Pierce's ranch became one of the most successful in the region, and he was elected to the town council, giving him a voice in Dalhart's future. Through it all, the love between Pierce and Beatrice only grew deeper and stronger. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration and misunderstanding, but they always worked through them with respect and communication, never letting problems fester or grow. They made time for each other despite the demands of children and work, stealing quiet moments on the porch in the evenings, or taking occasional rides across the prairie like they had during their courtship. When Bobby turned 10 and Sarah was 7, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant once more, a surprise but a welcome one. Their third child, a son they named Thomas James, arrived in early spring of 1893, completing their family. Pierce joked that they were outnumbered now, 3 children to 2 parents, but his joy was evident in every line of his face as he held his youngest son. By then, their home had been expanded significantly, a proper ranch house with multiple bedrooms, a real kitchen, and even a parlor where Beatrice kept her piano, a gift from Pierce on their 10th anniversary. The ranch itself had grown to encompass thousands of acres, with dozens of employees who looked to Pierce as a fair and respected boss. They were prosperous and successful by any measure, but more importantly, they were happy, truly and deeply happy. One evening in the fall of 1895, when Bobby was 13, Sarah was 10, and little Thomas was 2, Beatrice stood on the porch watching Pierce teach their older children how to rope fence posts in preparation for eventually roping cattle. The sun was setting in that spectacular way it always did over the Texas prairie, and she reflected on how different her life was from what she had imagined as a young woman in Boston. She had thought she would marry someone from her social circle, live in a brownstone in the city, have maybe 2 children who would be raised by nannies while she attended social functions and charity events. She had thought that was the only path available to her, the only future she could have. But then fate had intervened in the form of a gunshot and a cowboy who had caught her before she fell, and everything had changed. Now she was a rancher's wife, a mother of 3, a teacher who had educated dozens of frontier children over the years. She lived in a house that she and Pierce had built together through hard work and determination, on land that stretched as far as the eye could see. She had calluses on her hands from helping with ranch work during busy seasons, and she could ride a horse as well as anyone in town. She had become someone she never imagined she could be, someone stronger and more capable and more authentically herself than she had ever been in Boston. And she had Pierce, her partner in all things, her love and her best friend, the man who had promised her forever and had kept that promise every single day for 13 years now. He looked up at that moment, catching her watching him, and he smiled at her, that warm smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all this time. Later that night, after the children were asleep and she and Pierce were getting ready for bed, Beatrice moved to stand in front of the window, looking out at the moonlit prairie. Pierce came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About that first day we met," Beatrice replied, leaning back against him. "About how scared I was, how out of place I felt, how certain I was that coming to Dalhart had been a terrible mistake. And now I know it was the best decision I ever made. Coming here, meeting you, building this life together, it's been everything I never knew I needed." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you remember what you said to me that day you carried me across the threshold, after the wedding?" "This is yours forever," Pierce said immediately. "How could I forget? I meant every word, Beatrice. I know you did, and you've proven it every day since. But what I realized tonight, watching you with the children, looking at everything we've built together, is that it's not just the house or the land that's mine forever. It's you. You're mine forever, just as I'm yours, and that's what makes everything else matter." Pierce cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes shining with emotion in the moonlight. "I love you, Beatrice Vaughn. I loved you from almost the moment I met you, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. You're my heart, my home, my reason for everything." "And you're mine," Beatrice whispered before he kissed her, a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their years together, a kiss that promised years more to come. Outside, the Texas night wrapped around their ranch house, the stars brilliant in the clear sky, the wind whispering through the grass. Inside, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and safe. And in the master bedroom, a cowboy held his wife close, grateful beyond words for the day fate had brought them together, for the woman who had agreed to share his life and build something beautiful with him. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges to overcome and triumphs to celebrate. Bobby would eventually take over more responsibility on the ranch, proving to have his father's talent for the business. Sarah would surprise everyone by becoming a teacher like her mother, opening a school for girls in Dallas. Thomas would study veterinary medicine and return to Dalhart to care for the animals of the region. Pierce and Beatrice would become grandparents, delighting in the next generation as much as they had in raising their own children. But through it all, their love would remain the foundation, the solid ground beneath everything else. They would grow old together on that ranch, watching sunsets from their porch, holding hands as they had since the very beginning, still finding new ways to make each other laugh and feel cherished. And when Pierce was 72, and Beatrice was 70, when their children and grandchildren gathered for Christmas at the ranch house that had been expanded and improved over the decades, but still held the same essential warmth and love it had always possessed, Bobby would pull his mother aside. Dad told me a story once, he said, his own hair now streaked with gray. About the day he brought you home as his bride, about carrying you across the threshold and telling you that everything was yours forever. He said it was one of the most important moments of his life, making that promise to you. Beatrice felt tears prick at her eyes. It was one of the most important moments of my life, too. He kept that promise, Bobby continued. Every single day he kept it. You taught me what love looks like, you and Dad. You showed me what it means to build a life with someone, to be partners in every sense of the word. Sarah and Thomas and I, we're all who we are because of the example you set, because of the home you created for us. We did our best, Beatrice said softly. Your father and I, we just tried to love each other and love you children as much as we possibly could. That was always the most important thing. Bobby hugged his mother tight. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. That night, as Beatrice and Pierce prepared for bed in the room they had shared for nearly 50 years, Pierce pulled his wife into his arms in the same way he had done countless times before. Tired? He asked, kissing her temple. A little, but happy, so very happy. Beatrice looked up at her husband, seeing the years written on his face but also seeing the young man who had caught her in his arms and changed her life forever. Thank you, Pierce. For what? For everything. For saving me that day in the street. For courting me and marrying me and bringing me to this wonderful home. For our children and our grandchildren and this incredible life we've built together. For keeping your promise every single day that this would be mine forever. Pierce held her closer, his voice rough with emotion. It's been my privilege and my joy, loving you. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Beatrice Vaughn, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. They stood there in the moonlight, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other through decades of life with all its complexities and surprises. And in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms in the home they had built together, they were exactly where they were meant to be, living the forever they had promised each other on that distant December day when a cowboy had carried his new bride across the threshold and whispered words that would echo through a lifetime of love. The story of Pierce and Beatrice Vaughn became something of a legend in Dalhart, told and retold as the years passed, a testament to the power of love and commitment, to the beauty that could bloom even in the harsh conditions of the frontier. Young couples would look to them as an example, seeking their advice on marriage and family, and Pierce and Beatrice would always share the same wisdom they had learned through living it themselves. Love wasn't just a feeling, they would say. It was a choice, made every day, sometimes every hour when times were tough. It was work and compromise and communication. It was being willing to change and grow while also accepting each other exactly as you were. It was building something together that was greater than either of you could create alone. It was finding home not in a place but in a person, and then making that place as beautiful and welcoming as you could. And when Pierce passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, with Beatrice holding his hand and their children gathered around his bedside, his last words were, "I love you, B. Forever." Beatrice lived another 4 years after Pierce's death, never remarrying though she had offers, content to spend her remaining time with her children and grandchildren, teaching the youngest of them to read and filling their heads with stories about their grandfather and the life he had built. She kept the ranch running with Bobby's help, refusing to give up the land that held so many memories, the home that Pierce had promised would be hers forever. When she finally joined her husband in the small cemetery at the edge of Dalhart, her grave placed next to his under the shade of a cottonwood tree they had planted together decades before, the entire town turned out for her funeral. The schoolhouse closed for the day, a sign on the door reading "In memory of our beloved teacher." The current students, few of whom had actually been taught by her but all of whom knew her story, stood in respectful silence as she was laid to rest. Elizabeth Hartley, now Elizabeth Hartley Morrison, 83 years old and still sharp as a tack, delivered the eulogy. She spoke of a young teacher who had arrived in Dalhart all those years ago, frightened and uncertain but determined to make a difference. She spoke of how Beatrice Sutherland Vaughn had touched countless lives through her teaching, had raised 3 remarkable children, had built a legacy of love and dedication that would continue for generations. "She taught me to read," Elizabeth said, her voice wavering but strong. "But more than that, she taught me that I could be anything I wanted to be, that my mind was a gift to be treasured and developed, that being a woman didn't mean I had to limit my dreams. She taught all of us that lesson in one way or another. She showed us what it meant to be brave, to take chances, to build something meaningful with your life. And she showed us what true love looked like, the kind that lasts a lifetime and beyond." As Beatrice was lowered into the ground next to her beloved Pierce, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood together, united in their grief, but also in their gratitude for the woman who had given them life and love in such abundance. Bobby placed a handful of Texas prairie soil on his mother's casket, whispering, "Rest well, Mama. Dad's been waiting for you." And in the years that followed, the ranch stayed in the Vaughn family, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Pierce and Beatrice had built. The house was preserved and eventually turned into a museum of sorts, a place where people could come and see how frontier families had lived, could walk through rooms where love and laughter had echoed for decades, could stand on the porch where 2 people had watched countless sunsets together. The schoolhouse in Dalhart was eventually renamed the Beatrice Sutherland Vaughn Education Center, a fitting tribute to the woman who had dedicated so much of her life to teaching. Her journals, faithfully kept from that first day Pierce had given her the leather-bound book, were published and became required reading in Texas history classes, offering a first-hand account of frontier life from a woman's perspective. And the story of the cowboy who caught a falling woman and loved her for the rest of his life, who carried his bride across the threshold and promised her forever, who kept that promise through 50 years of marriage, became the kind of tale that parents told their children and grandparents told their grandchildren, a reminder that true love existed, that it was worth fighting for, that it could flourish even in the harshest conditions if 2 people were willing to work for it. In the museum that had once been their home, visitors would pause in the main room, the very spot where Pierce had carried Beatrice across the threshold all those decades ago, and they would read the words engraved on a brass plaque on the wall, Pierce's words to his bride on that long-ago December day. "This is yours forever." And somehow, standing in that room with the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, with the Texas prairie stretching out beyond in all directions, visitors could feel the truth of those words, could sense the love that had filled this place, could understand that some promises, when made with a whole heart and kept with unwavering dedication, really do last forever. And that, more than anything else, was the story worth telling, the story worth remembering, the story that would echo through time as long as there were people who believed in the power of love to change lives and create something beautiful out of the raw materials of courage and hope, and an unwavering commitment to another human soul. The cowboy had carried his bride across the threshold and whispered that everything was hers forever, and in doing so, he had created not just a moment but a lifetime, not just a promise but a legacy, not just a love story but a testament to the enduring power of 2 hearts finding their perfect match and choosing every day to honor and cherish what they had found in each other. Forever. That was what Pierce had promised, and forever was what they had achieved in every way that mattered.